The groom humiliates the bride in front of everyone, without realizing her father is listening. The sky was outrageously blue that morning. No clouds, no wind, just a beautiful, rehearsed silence that covered Los Cedros estate like a veil of false perfection. Inside, everything was calculated. The aisle of white flowers, the altar surrounded by Roman columns, the orchestra playing a classic too slow to hide what no one dared to say out loud. There was tension in the air, the kind no one names, but everyone feels. Mariana Souza walked slowly down the aisle, arm in arm with her father. A white dress, no exaggerations, hair pinned back with elegance, an almost invisible smile. Her face was a flawless mask, but her eyes seemed trapped somewhere else, a place where maybe it was still possible to turn back. Beside her, General Antonio Souza walked with the same posture with which he had crossed battlefields. Upright, eyes steady, chin firm. He did not smile. He did not look to the sides. He knew he was being observed, as he always had been. And even without saying a word, he protected his daughter like a man escorting a border on the verge of being violated. At the altar, Alejandro Ramirez waited. Impeccable. Dark suit, gray tie, his hair slightly tousled, on purpose, of course. Everything about him seemed calculated, including the smile he offered when he saw her. A hollow, almost cynical smile. The smile of someone who didn't expect to marry but to win. The ceremony began as if nothing were wrong. Words of love, of honor, of future. The officiant spoke of family union, of deep roots, of tradition. The orchestra punctuated the phrases with sweetness. Some guests were moved, more by the setting than by the couple. This wasn't a wedding, it was a showcase. And then the moment of the vows arrived. Alejandro stepped forward. There was a subtle shift in the bodies around him. Important people leaned forward slightly. Phones were discreetly raised. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say. But what came wasn't a promise. It was a blow. He began with a soft tone. Empty thanks, generic compliments. Then a detour. Words that sounded out of place, laced with hidden poison. He spoke as if dismantling a narrative, not as if building a home. Mariana felt it before she even understood. Within seconds, the ceremony turned into a courtroom. Alejandro coldly exposed personal secrets. He hinted at emotional betrayals, spoke of messages exchanged with other men, questioned her love with a smile on his lips. He claimed he didn't want to lie to those present, as if doing them a favor. He accused, insinuated, judged, all with surgical calm. There was no anger, only vanity. The elite watched in shock. Some hands discreetly covered mouths. Glances were exchanged. The whispers began, short but sharp. Mariana stood motionless. For the first time, she didn't even know what to do. She was there, at the altar, hearing her reputation being shredded by a man who, just minutes before, had sworn he loved her. But she wasn't the first to react. Her father was. The dry sound of the general's ceremonial cane echoed like a gunshot. Everyone fell silent. The general rose with the authority of a man who had faced battlefields and wasn't afraid of public ruin. His eyes did not waver. Neither did his voice. He didn't defend his daughter with shouts. He didn't lose control. He simply said enough. Enough for everyone to understand. The ceremony ended there. That Alejandro had dishonored not only Mariana but the guests, the protocol, and himself. That this wasn't courage. It was cowardice disguised as honesty. Then he turned to the guests. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. To those who still respected basic values of decency, he suggested they leave. Those who wished to partake in that silent humiliation should remain. The rest should stand up and walk away. For a few seconds, no one moved, until an elegant woman, seated in the front row, stood up, and with her, her husband. Then, a senator, a judge, businessmen, board members, investors, politicians, diplomats. One by one, they began leaving their seats. There was no rush, no hysteria. It was a silent abandonment. Alejandro remained standing at the altar, alone amidst the luxury that no longer protected him. The social power he had cultivated evaporated before his eyes, because in that room, honor was worth more than inheritance. Mariana still didn't move, but now something had changed in her. There were no tears, no shame. There was clarity. She walked up to the groom, or the man who had tried to ruin her, and handed him the ring. She said nothing. The gesture was stronger than any speech. The way she extended her hand, the way she placed the cold gold in his palm, the way she turned her back without hurry, it wasn't refusal. It was liberation. And then she walked, alone, under everyone's gaze. Each step dissolved Alejandro's words. Each yard covered was a silent response. Her dress floated lightly behind her, and the flowered aisle, once a symbol of a shared path, now became the track of her autonomy. The altar was left empty. Alejandro, exposed, was beginning to understand what he had just done. The recording of his speech was already circulating on phones. Shocked faces appeared in short clips sent to private groups and exclusive lists. Within hours, it would take over social media. Within days, his name would begin to crumble. But Mariana never looked back. She didn't need to. The public humiliation he had orchestrated became the founding act of the new woman being born in that instant. The general's daughter ceased to be a shadow and became her own light, not because she was wounded, but because she knew how to cross the wound without bowing down. And in the silence that followed, heavy, absolute, reverent, it became clear to everyone. Mariana Souza had been destroyed at the altar, but she was reborn before even leaving it. The scandal exploded before night even fell. In the first hours after the interrupted wedding, Los Cedros estate looked like an abandoned battlefield. The empty altar, the fallen flowers, waiters trying to collect forgotten glasses, no music, no toasts, just echoes. The old voices of the elite trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. But the outside world already knew. Videos of Alejandro's speech spread like poison in a champagne glass. The cruel words, the arrogant look, Mariana's gesture of returning the ring. It was all recorded, edited, shared. No context could save it, no alternate version. In Mexico, in Brazil, in the closed circles of the international elite, there was no other topic of conversation. The wedding that was supposed to unite two empires became a public masterclass in self-destruction. The Ramirez surname, once untouchable, now slipped through fingers like tainted sand. Alejandro tried to react. First, he hid behind short notes crafted by his PR team. Then, he turned to old allies, friendly journalists, trusted businessmen, powerful figures with debts owed. But it didn't work. Public opinion needed no proof. It had video, it had witnesses, it had Mariana's silence, and that more than any statement was a sentence. Because Mariana never appeared. She disconnected completely. No statements, no interviews, no public appearances. She disappeared from social media, from social circles, from headlines. Her name grew, even in absence, or perhaps because of it. Silence became her armor, her strategy, her language. Meanwhile, Alejandro was sinking. He lost multi-million-dollar contracts with international investors. A deal with a Canadian fund was frozen. 2 luxury developments in São Paulo and Cancun were suspended for reputational review. The press exposed details of his backstage behavior. Silenced labor lawsuits, abusive clauses, the use of frontmen. Ruin stopped being a rumor. It became consequence. And in the middle of this collapse, his allies vanished. Those who once boasted of standing by his side now avoided being seen with him. The elite is quick when it decides to erase someone, and with Alejandro, it was ruthless. Mariana, meanwhile, was far away, very far. Blurred photos from airports suggested she had flown to Europe just days after the scandal. Then an image of her walking through The Hague in the Netherlands. Discreet, no makeup, a folder of documents under her arm. No luxury, no spotlight. She seemed like another woman. Or perhaps the woman she had always been, and no one had seen. It was later discovered that she had enrolled in an extension course in public international law, focused on institutional violence and psychological crimes. She attended UN forums as an observer. She spent days in silence, reading, studying, listening to stories of other women who had also been silenced, exposed, discredited. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking purpose. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, General Antonio Sousa was facing another kind of war. Despite the public support he had received on the day of the ceremony, rumors began to surface. Anonymous voices planted news stories, insinuations about controversial decisions in his military career, the kind of maneuver that doesn't aim to prove anything, just smear enough to weaken. Someone was trying to tarnish his image, someone with resources, contacts and motivation. But the general knew how to play, and more than that, he knew how to wait. He withdrew from the public circuit. He didn't respond to provocations. He limited himself to a brief note days after the scandal, reaffirming his pride in his daughter and his contempt for any attempt to turn cowardice into narrative. It was enough to make headlines. The general who doesn't back down. The silence that unsettles. And, almost naturally, Mariana and her father became symbols of dignity, of firmness, of something rare. But not everything was balanced. There were attacks, of course. Groups claimed Mariana had staged everything, that the video was fake, that it was all part of a plan to destroy Alejandro and seize part of the empire. Even theories about an old romance between Mariana and one of Alejandro's rivals circulated in business forums. She didn't respond, because she didn't need to. Alejandro's downfall was self-inflicted. He had done everything himself. The altar was his weapon and his trap. Without Mariana, without contracts, without influence, Alejandro became avoided. His meetings were cancelled, his phone calls ignored. In less than 2 months, he went from promising heir to cautionary tale. A story parents told their children to explain why reputation is worth more than wealth. But there was more. An old accusation against him from a former fiancé resurfaced. Dismissed for lack of evidence at the time, it now carried new weight after recent events. The courts reopened the case. The media brought back the woman's name, and with her came other stories, other voices. What had once been ruin now bordered on complete collapse. Mariana, meanwhile, remained silent, but she was no longer absence. She was projected presence. Her name began appearing as a reference in debates about psychological abuse in legal settings. Her example was cited in articles, interviews, conferences, and all of it without her needing to say a single word. The whole world heard her answer, even if she never spoke it. And there, among headlines and rumors, between silence and outcry, a new narrative began to take shape. Not that of the betrayed woman, nor the abandoned bride, but of the woman who was exposed and didn't hide, the one who was disrespected and didn't need revenge, the one who fell before everyone, but chose to rise without needing applause. And while Alejandro counted the pieces of what once was his world, Mariana was drawing another, from another place, in another way, with another voice. A voice that soon could no longer be ignored. Time passed, not quickly, but steadily. From scandal to reconstruction, from altar to courtroom, just over 12 months had passed. Exactly 1 year since the day Mariana Sousa returned a ring before an audience dressed to applaud a wedding, and ended up applauded for refusing to pretend. But Mariana did not rebuild in a rush. While the world speculated about her next step, she chose silence as shelter and discipline as compass. First came the studies. Secluded in The Hague, at the heart of global legal decision-making, She immersed herself in themes that had always attracted her, but now carried new weight: emotional violence, psychological power, manipulation within both personal and institutional relationships. Law ceased to be just a profession. It became a mission. She attended sessions at the International Court with notebook in hand, eyes sharp, expression steady. She spoke little. She observed everything. Her notes weren't academic, they were strategies. Mariana wasn't there just to learn. She was preparing. When she reappeared, it wasn't at a party, or in a magazine, or at a social event. It was at a public hearing in Geneva, during an international forum on invisible gender violence. Mariana was one of the invited panelists, without fanfare, without campaign. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and spoke with a calm that cut through the air, without mentioning names, without recounting her story directly, but everyone knew. She wasn't speaking about herself, she was speaking for many. And there, in that cold, protocol-driven auditorium, Mariana ceased to be just the woman who faced Alejandro Ramirez at the altar. She became a reference. Experts began seeking her out. Organizations offered partnerships. Universities requested her presence at seminars. Her demeanor, discreet, incisive, clear, was in absolute contrast with the spectacle the world had witnessed the year before. And precisely for that reason, impossible to ignore. That same year, she founded the Horizonte Institute, an organization dedicated to providing free legal assistance to women in situations of psychological violence. It wasn't just any NGO. It operated with technical precision and surgical discretion. No celebrity campaigns, no spectacle. Mariana designed the institute the way one builds a case, with method, with foundation, with purpose. The team was composed of lawyers, therapists, former judges and young interns, all with one thing in common: they knew what it meant to be disbelieved. There, Mariana was director, but also colleague. She didn't place herself above others. She was firm, demanding, but human. And so quietly, she rebuilt not only her career, but her name. Meanwhile, on the other side, Alejandro was sinking deeper than anyone imagined. The reopened complaint by his former fiancée was now turning into a trial. The evidence, once fragile, gained strength with new accounts, new testimonies, new victims. What began as rumor became headline, and what had been public humiliation transformed into potential criminal conviction. He, who was once seen as the bold heir, became the symbol of an old system in collapse. And Mariana, ironically, never had to mention him to dismantle him. The press insisted. They asked for interviews, documentaries, books, but she declined them all. She only spoke when it made sense. That was how she accepted the UN's invitation, almost a year after the scandal, to receive an award for her legal work with the Horizonte Institute. A rare honor given to professionals who contributed to transforming social structures through law. The ceremony would be discreet, diplomatic, small. But the chosen location was surprising: Los Cedros Estate, the very same place, the very same setting. The stage where Mariana had been publicly exposed was now preparing to welcome her with a different light. The columns restored, the altar converted into a stage. The flowers, no longer white, now red and gold. The aisle no longer led to a groom, it led to a microphone. Mariana arrived on time. She wore a simply cut dress, but of heavy fabric. The kind of clothing that doesn't ask for attention, it commands it. She walked alone, not coldly, but with clarity. She was whole, and it was visible. As she climbed the stage for a moment, the hall fell silent, not out of fear, not out of reverence, out of respect. The kind that can't be bought, demanded, or faked. She looked straight ahead. She breathed, and then she spoke. She said that award wasn't hers. It belonged to the women who had never been heard. She thanked the Institute's team, the families who had entrusted their silence to that cause. And then she paused, looked to the back of the room, and said firmly, without hesitation, I also thank the man who tried to destroy me because he set me free. The hall froze. There was no name, no attack, only truth. That sentence hung in the air like an inverted confession. Mariana wasn't forgiving, but she wasn't carrying hatred either. She carried awareness. She knew what that day represented. For her, for others, for the system. At the end of the speech, she was given a standing ovation. Among those present, some familiar faces, people who, a year earlier, had rushed out of the ceremony, frightened, confused. Now, they were there, standing, recognizing not only what she had suffered, but what she had built afterward. Outside, rumors said Alejandro was nearby, sitting in a car, accompanied by an aide, watching everything from a distance. No one confirmed it. No one cared. Because that day was no longer about him. It was about her. Mariana Souza was no longer just the name of a wounded woman who reacted with elegance. She was the symbol of something new. And the most ironic part? She didn't win because she had responded. She won because she knew how to remain silent at the right time and to speak when the world was ready to listen. The Los Cedros estate awoke in silence. It wasn't the same silence as before, the one heavy with tension, designed to hide the inevitable. This was different. A clean silence, respectful, like the kind that precedes a ceremony that truly matters. 1 year had passed since the scandal that turned the wedding of the year into a social earthquake. And now, on that same ground where rings were returned and masks fell, Mariana Souza returned. This time, not as a bride, but as a symbol. The ceremony organized by the UN to honor her would have no media coverage, no live broadcast, no large audience. It was meant to be intimate, dignified, direct, like her. Even so, the invitation reached diplomats, jurists, activists, and representatives of international organizations, people who understood that being there was more than a political gesture. It was an act of respect. The estate was carefully prepared, but without ostentation. The columns cleaned, discreet arrangements, the aisles now lined with small frames displaying quotes from anonymous women assisted by the Horizonte Institute. Every step to the stage was also a reminder. Mariana wasn't there because of her pain. She was there because of what she did with it. She arrived on time. She wore black, not in mourning, but in solidity. A dress without sparkle, without lace, without curves, but with structure. The kind of clothing that doesn't need to explain anything. She walked alone, as she had ever since deciding she would no longer be led by anyone else. She greeted the guests discreetly, climbed the steps to the stage, looked around, and took a deep breath. There she was, in the same place where, a year earlier, someone had tried to destroy her in front of everyone. The same altar, the same sky, but a different story. This time, written by her. She accepted the award with serenity. A small glass sculpture, delicate, engraved with a simple inscription, "Justice with Dignity," the title of the international recognition that now bore her name. When she approached the microphone, the hall fell silent. She didn't give a technical speech, nor a political one. She didn't cite laws or data. She spoke of what she had seen, of the women who came to her afraid of being called crazy, of those disbelieved by their own families, of those who had been silent for 20 years and spoke for the first time at their 7th session, of those who didn't survive. Her voice was low, but firm, unhurried, like someone who knows she doesn't need to shout to be heard. At one point, she stopped, looked for a moment at the altar as if searching for a specific point in memory. There was no pain in her gaze, no anger. There was lucidity. And then she said what no one expected to hear. "I returned to this place today by choice, because I understood that we shouldn't flee from the spaces that wounded us. We need to reappear in them when we're ready, not to win, but to show that we survived." Pause. Some eyes welled up. She continued, "On that day, someone tried to shame me before everyone, but without realizing it, he gave me what no wedding gift ever could, the chance not to lose myself. I could have gone through with that marriage, and maybe it would have taken me years to understand that it wasn't love. Being exposed was painful, but it was also what set me free." Another pause. She breathed calmly. "That is why I am grateful. I am grateful to my father, who taught me to stand tall even when everything collapses. I am grateful to the women who entrusted their stories to the Horizonte Institute. And yes, I am grateful to the man who took me from the altar." The silence that followed wasn't one of shock. It was of acceptance, of understanding, of respect. She concluded by saying she didn't see that honor as a prize, but as a milestone, and that she hoped, from then on, no woman would ever again need to be destroyed to discover her own strength. The applause came after, not euphoric, not cold, but real. Mariana left the stage with the same calm with which she had climbed it. She received greetings, a few hugs, but she didn't stay long. She had learned that the role of symbol was heavy and that it was necessary to return inward before losing sight of what really mattered. At the exit of the estate, she stopped for a moment by the central fountain. The sun reflected softly on the water, and there, in silence, she seemed to revisit everything. The steps taken to the altar, the words spoken against her, the moment she chose not to remain silent. A black car was parked on the other side of the property. They said Alejandro was inside, alone, watching from afar. Mariana didn't look. She didn't need to. She had ended that story long before that day. But now she did it with a gesture only the strong can make, to give thanks without expecting anything in return. In Alejandro's life, only ruins and ghosts remained. In hers, mission, she didn't leave avenged, she left complete. And that late afternoon, as the sky turned golden over the same ground where she had once been humiliated, Mariana Souza sealed what many spend a lifetime trying to learn: that dignity is not inherited. It is built, step by step, even if the first step is walking out of your own wedding alone. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't try to rewrite the past. She simply moved forward with firmness, with purpose, with truth. And that was more powerful than any revenge. If this story touched you in any way, take a deep breath and share it. Maybe someone needs to hear it today. Maybe you do. And if you want to see more stories like this, you already know what to do. Take care. Until next time.